You all know that, right? Anyway, let's say good morning to our guest. Good morning, Dr. Farrell. Thank you for joining us this morning. Could that come in? Thank you for
You're
joining us this
very
morning.
welcome, Paul. Good to be here.
Thank you, Dr. Farrell, for joining us. Of
Very
course,
welcome.
Paul and
You
Brenda.
understand, you understand my questions, right, Dr. Farrell? You've been around long enough.
I've been around a long time.
That's right. Those are coming. They can be considered no less legitimate. Yes, Pan is a national instrument, but they are critical, important artistic expressions in Trinidad and Tobago.
Mm.
And they are not to feel slighted where we headquarters. Anyway, we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about constitutional reform. And you are part of the committee
Yes.
appointed by the Honorable Prime Minister to galvanize public opinion on the issues related to constitutional reform. The committee has submitted its first report, if I'm not mistaken, to the Prime Minister. Would that be correct?
That's correct. First and last. We don't have any more to go.
Oh, you have no more. I thought, for some reason, I heard news that some extension had been given, but so your work
Yes,
is done.
yeah, the extension is given in order to prepare for the conference to come.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's a conference coming up to discuss the issues contained
Correct.
therein.
Correct.
Okay.
Now, I attended one, the one in City Hall.
Yes.
And it was quite interesting. I don't think the committee, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. But let me ask the question. How do you think the response had been to the call for the public to come out and give their opinion? Let me start with that question.
Well, quite frankly, I think it was excellent. And let me try to explain why. We received over 800 submissions by email. And one of the things that I try to point out to people is that if you go back to the Wooding Commission in 1972-74, the Wooding Commission received 100 submissions, including one from myself. And so even at that time, the population was about 750,000. So even if you allow for that, we did a lot better. The second issue is that I think people seem to think that if you want to get the views of people on a subject, and for example, you've just done your poll where you had 43 respondents, that you need to talk to thousands of people. That is simply not so. For a population like Trinidad and Tobago, an electorate of about 1.1 million people, you just need to talk to several hundred people in order to get a sense as to what people are thinking and so on. Just to illustrate, in the United States, when they are polling for elections, like now the presidential election and so on, the electorate in the United States is 260 million people. When the best pollsters go outside there, they usually sample between 2,000 and 8,000 people in the United States with an electorate of 260 million people.
That's less than 1%.
Exactly. And so if you have any sort of basic familiarity with statistics, then, I saw some people talk about the fact that we had a paltry response and so on. That is simply not correct. And I think it kind of betrays a lack of knowledge of or understanding of statistics. We think our response was excellent. And I think that we took advantage of the fact that people sent in stuff by email. And that varied from one-liners to people who submitted extensive and long essays, really, on various aspects of constitutional reform. In addition to that, we had the town hall meetings. Some of them were poorly attended, that is true, but overall we had over 300 people attending the town hall meetings. And we had 3 youth forums, one in Tobago and 2 in Trinidad, which was also well attended by young people. And that's an opportunity for people to talk, as you did when you came to the City Hall. People can talk and they can explain and they can elaborate on their views. So we think that the response was excellent. And moreover, when you look at what the responses we got, they are very consistent with what the Ramadan Committee got in 2013. And even if you go back to the Wooding Commission is very consistent with what people were saying even 50 years ago. So we are very, very comfortable with what with the responses that we've got.
It's not quantity, it's quality.
Both quantity and quality of the responses that we got. Yes.
Yeah. You know, and I know there are lots of people who may have contributed when the People's Partnership was doing their constitutional exercise. And then you have this other one, and there's a portion of Trinidadians and Barbadians that'll be a little jaded about it.
Yes.
Because they'll feel I am putting forward effort that will amount to naught.
Correct.
Because the current construct requires the participation of the opposition or a party having the overwhelming majority to achieve that constitutional reform. But when you go through an exercise, Dr. Farrell, like that constitutional exercise, and you present this document, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, but at a PNM rally, they dismissed certain things like 2 terms, then they fixed. So they've already started dismissing consultations with citizens. Why does that engender any faith in the citizenry that their voices are truly heard if it narrowly comes down to the decisions of a few people, whoever constitution moves forward, and oftentimes one person?
Okay, so let me try to respond to that, Richard, in a number of different ways. First of all, there are currently 5 constitutional reform exercises taking place across the region. In Belize, in Jamaica, in Barbados, in Trinidad and Tobago, and Guyana has just started one, although the Guyanese constitution is the most recent Caribbean constitution. 5 at the same time. And I think what it is telling us is that there is a demand, if you like, for change of our constitutional arrangements, which were bequeathed to us by the British. And there's now a demand to change those arrangements because those arrangements are clearly not working well for us. The second point I would make is that when you look at constitutional reform efforts across the globe, across the world, most of them actually fail. And the reason for that is not very hard to discern. The reason for that is that almost by definition, a constitutional reform exercise, if it is done properly and if it is done with integrity, is going to make recommendations for changing the balance of power in the society, in the government, the balance of power between the parliament and the executive and the judiciary and the independent institutions. And those are very much evident in the recommendations that we have made. Now, for those people who currently hold power, it is not in their interest to change that, particularly if there are recommendations which diminish or constrain or restrict their power. And this is why, in most instances, constitutional reform exercises tend to run aground. And in Chile, for example, they spent 2 years in an elaborate exercise that has just stopped. So the pathway to success is narrow. In respect of Trinidad, you're quite right. Constitutional change requires a special majority, especially for those provisions in the Constitution which are entrenched. And any meaningful reform is, in fact, going to attach to those entrenched provisions. So therefore, you are going to need a special majority. Our process, our procedure, and our faith is that Parliament has been put there by the people of Trinidad and Tobago. They are not our masters. We are their masters. And therefore, if you have a process where the people of Trinidad and Tobago are saying to the parliamentarians who we have put there that this is what we want, then I think they ought to respect that. They may not, but they ought to respect that. The other point, the last point, is that in respect of the PNM's recent convention, we have put forward a report and recommendations. That report and recommendations are for everyone to examine, everyone to critique, everyone to put forward their views. So we are expecting, in fact, and we are welcoming every political party, every NGO, every business organization, every trade union to look at our report, look at our recommendations, and to come up with their own if they don't agree with what we have said. The only thing that I am saying that they should do when they are doing that is that they, number one, their responses or their recommendations ought to be based on principle. There must be a basis for what you are saying. Secondly, that it must be reasoned. There must be a rationale for your recommendation. And it must be offered in the spirit of trying to move the process forward. So we have absolutely no difficulty if people disagree with what we have said. Not at all. In fact, it would be quite odd if people didn't, because you are in fact working on creating and change, and people may not like change. So a prime minister will obviously want to keep the election date in his back pocket. But the point is that the prime minister keeping the election date in his back pocket is a fundamentally undemocratic exercise. It's an undemocratic process. It's arbitrary. And so therefore it is inconsistent with the principle of a sovereign democratic state. It's simply not, it's, well, quite frankly, normatively, right, one can argue it's simply wrong to do that. Now, we have inherited that from the British. That's how the British did their thing. They, you just call the election whenever it is you feel that you want to do that. But the question is, for Trinidad and Tobago, is it consistent with principle to do that? Every sitting prime minister, again, would want to say, well, I will serve for 25 years.
And I guess the question is, who does that serve? Does this serve the incumbent, or does this serve the people widely in a transparent and accountable way? Dr. Farrell, I looked at an interview that yourself and the chairman of the committee did on TTT, and one of the issues that came up was the issue of the savings clause.
Yes.
And for the members of the public looking on who may not understand, first of all, explain what a savings clause is.
Yes.
And what are the implications of evolving the process forward to remove that saving clause, and what impact that will have on lawmaking moving forward.
Okay. So the savings clause, which is section 6 of the current constitution, was put into the constitution essentially to save all previous legislation that had been passed when Trinidad and Tobago was a colony. And that made very good sense at the time. In fact, most Caribbean countries had a savings clause, except I think one. And in some cases, their savings clause was limited. They said it's only for 5 years. In our case, we put in what is called a general savings clause, which was unlimited in time. The savings clause was functional in the sense that it saved all previous legislation. So you didn't have to go back as a new independent parliament and simply re-legislate everything, because there are hundreds of pieces of legislation, hundreds of ordinances. So it simply made sense to say these continue. However, what the savings clause also did was that it said that if you had a previous piece of legislation done as a colony, and that legislation was found to be in breach of our fundamental rights, that is to say, sections 4 and 5 of the Constitution, you couldn't change it. You couldn't declare it to be unconstitutional. And so therefore, what you had in that is that you had legislation enacted under Trinidad and Tobago as a colony, which trumped the Constitution. So you had ordinary legislation, which was in fact higher than the Constitution, and the Constitution is supposed to be supreme law. It is fundamentally inconsistent, and it is not consistent with a sovereign democratic state, which is what we are. So you'll see in our report that we have the principles that we have articulated, sovereignty being one, and the issues that we have put under the sovereignty column, that is the number one. The savings clause is inconsistent with a sovereign democratic state. And so therefore it has to go.
Why do you think then that there has not been a move to remove that? Because you have explained it quite pellucidly
Yes.
I think the present legislators and past legislators understand that.
Yes.
Legal luminaries understand that,
Yes.
particularly post 1976, when the Republican Constitution came into effect, when we
Yes.
became a republic. But we
Yes.
have not since 1976 seen people to move past that saving clause.
That's right.
Yeah.
Why? I don't understand it.
Well, I don't understand it either, Paul. And it's very interesting that there's a very recent case which went to the Privy Council. And the Privy Council, this had to do with, I think it's the Chandler matter. It's Chandler number 2 matter at the Privy Council. And the Privy Council said, listen, there's nothing that we can do about this thing. This thing may be unjust, but it is constitutional. It is constitutional because it is saved law, and we can't do anything about it. And they went on further to say it is for the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago to fix this problem. We can't help you. Now, the CCJ has a different perspective on the matter. The perspective of the Caribbean Court of Justice is that you cannot have anything, even if it is like a savings clause, which trumps the Constitution, which is the supreme law. And so therefore, the Privy Council, when that case has come up in other jurisdictions, for example, in the case of Barbados, it has come up and so on, they have said, no, you can't have that, okay? And they have struck it down. They have said that those provisions are unconstitutional, and therefore they struck it down. The Privy Council refused to do that, and they said, let the Parliament fix it. And the Parliament has to fix it. It is about time. And we have found that it is after 50 years, there is absolutely no need to save all these outdated legislation. For example, there are things in there like the sedition thing, which is currently in the court. There are things in there about that discriminate against people because of their sexual orientation, that an immigration officer can prevent somebody from coming into Trinidad and Tobago because they are homosexual. That kind of quite frankly, let me just say, use the word foolishness, right? We have inherited from an old colonial time, and it continues to be there, and you can't challenge it.
But the ironic thing is the country that handed down to us has moved past that.
Oh, absolutely. This is the ironic thing.
It's the ironic thing.
Yeah.
It is quite ironic. And you know, even the mandatory death penalty, which is under the Offences of the Person Act, which makes the penalty for murder mandatorily is death.
Yeah.
And most countries have simply either moved past the death penalty completely, or you have recognized that there may be instances where somebody has committed a murder, but the circumstances are such that the death penalty is not warranted. We can't do that. A judge in Trinidad and Tobago has to follow the law, and therefore has to sentence the person to death. And that's quietly, I mean, it's not right. We've got to fix that.
Yeah. Well, I think the Caribbean country that did not have the savings clause is the one that got it right. And because when I first started as a constitutional law student, I never understood what was the concept. What were they thinking when they fabricated and constructed that 1962 Constitution? Because it was like, and I think part of it was a colonial mindset. I think part of it is rooted in that, that you were taking a brave new step, so to speak, as an independent territory, and they felt they wanted the security of knowing, well, these laws still exist, rather than saying, look, if these laws are incompatible with sections 4 and 5, out they go.
Out they go, yes, exactly.
Out they go.
But remember that time too, we were still under the sovereign of the king. So, that's why I specified particularly post 1976.
Yes, that's right. Yes, it is odd why the Winning Commission left it, and they didn't actually discuss it at all, which is a little strange because I mean you had people there like Justice Georges and Wooding himself, Michael de Labastide was on that, and it really is a little odd that they didn't address that issue.
Given all the iterations, I think there were 5 or 6 documents on constitutional reform.
Yes.
I think the most productive of those had been the 1974, which predicated the Republican Constitution. Would you agree with that?
Yes, but
go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Yes, but Rick Williams at the time didn't implement 90% of what Wooding recommended. essentially what happened with the Wooding Commission report, which would have been quite precedent-setting if it had been implemented, is that Williams basically took it and put it in a drawer. He implemented out of it the ombudsman. Of course, they removed the governor general and made the president, and they shifted some powers from the prime minister to the president. And quite frankly, that was about it. And the point is that I think we know now that the 76th Constitution does not reflect any of the draft constitutions that the Wooding Commission had done, but was in fact drafted by Ellis Clark. So Clark was involved in the 62 Constitution and in the 76th Constitution. So the Wooding Commission report and draft constitutions never saw the light of day for the most part.
Let me ask a strange question. Do you think the public really cares? The wider public? I mean, and I'm not saying that to diminish the work of the committee or people who would have come to the constitutions or sent emails or correspondences about their thoughts on constitutional reform, but the wider public, do you think they understand how it can and should impact their lives if there is meaningful constitutional change, or does it just get mired in the political entanglement we have in this country?
Yeah, I think so. Starting with the last point that you've made, politics in this country tends to trump and to tangle up everything, quite unfortunately. The second point is that we have abandoned what we used to call civics education in our primary and secondary schools. So you remember when in primary schools in the 1960s and so on, we had a subject called civics, which students were taught about how the society functions, how government functions, about the Senate and the House of Representatives, etc., etc. And we did that. In the American society, for example, kids understand and they are taught the American Constitution from very early. We don't have that. And what little that we had of it in the 1960s, we dropped it from the curriculum. So therefore, we have a few generations of Trinidadians who really don't have any profound understanding of the Constitution and what it means and how it impacts their lives, except I would say that they do have an understanding that they are in a system, that they vote every 5 years, and that there are political parties, and that there's a judiciary. They do have an understanding of those kinds of basic things, but they don't have an appreciation as to whether or not those things can be made to work better, which is therefore what is constitutional reform. They have no sense of that. And so therefore part of the process is about education. And we've made that point in the report. We've emphasized that point in the report, getting back to a situation where whether you keep this current constitution, hopefully not, or you change it to something better, there is a process of education starting from early childhood all the way up to early secondary school level, where the students can get an understanding of the system of government that they have.
Yeah. I mean, it's so... I mean, the country needs constitutional reform so desperately in terms of moving that system of accountability and those checks and balances that are more robust, and the sharing, devolving of power.
Yes.
And I think a lot of citizens want that. And I think maybe they're a little bit more informed than we give them credit for.
Yes.
But I think they become a little jaded, that they think, well, look, the current construct probably means nothing is going to happen.
Yes.
That small window of success that you talked about, Dr. Farrell.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think they're realistic that, look, unless somebody has the vast majority of seats,
yes,
there is very little chance of constitutional agreement going to take place between the current two parties in power.
Well, what I would say, though, is that I think that we should be shifting the conversation away from the two parties to ourselves. And you see, if I think people understand that we are the ones who are ultimately in control, you see, we can put them in power and we can remove them if we want. So if you have a set of recommendations for reform and people are saying, we want you to have two-term limits, we want to have the right of recall, we want to have referendums, we want to have a more effective and independent president, and then you have a political party which says, we are having none of that, well, then it is entirely...
But let me put a pin, Dr. Farrell, because as we said, it becomes mired in political alignment very often, and rational reasoning goes out the door.
Yes.
at the altar of political alignment. So you
Yes.
say, we want, but then the prime minister or the opposition leader makes a statement on his or her perspective or his or her party's perspective
Right.
on some of the recommendations.
Yes.
And very often people just line up behind that
That's
because
true.
that leader has made a statement.
That's
So,
true.
so that is part of what we're dealing with also. So when you say we want, who
Yes.
is this we? We is
Yes.
not a homogeneous we.
Yes. But I would think, though, Paul, that I would rather doubt. I mean, I haven't looked at their report, the PNM's report, but I would doubt, quite frankly, that the majority of people or a lot of people in the PNM agree with those.
I'm not saying they do, but I'm saying
You know,
there's a lot of
yeah.
influence that comes from a political leader making a statement.
That is absolutely true. That is absolutely true. And there are a lot of people who are not aligned to any political party.
Mm-hmm.
And we also have people who are influential in the community, including the media itself, for example, that if the media took on the responsibility of surfacing these issues, of explaining them, of calling out the leadership of the political parties on positions which are irrational or which are not based on principle, then it can have an effect, I think, in terms of people's perception of their leaders and of the positions that they have taken.
One of the
But it comes back to our civic.
Let me just put a question from the chat here because I think it's a very good question from Carlisle Cupid. If Dr. Farrell can identify a country that has recently undergone a successful exercise like this that we can learn from.
That's a good one. That's a good question.
Good question.
That's a very good question. Usually, constitutional reform exercises come in situations of extreme situations, of situations where the society is, well, I don't want to say revolution, but there is some kind of extreme set of circumstances which kind of push people towards having that reform. Instances of where you have committees and commissions and people sit down and so on, as we try to do in the Caribbean here, as we are trying now in the Caribbean. If you look at what the process is happening in Jamaica, for example, you're getting that same kind of tribal.
So some sort of crisis.
Yes. You need to have some kind of crisis, quite frankly, that is going to force the change on people. So, very good question, and I will do some research on it to see.
Richard,
the Chilean process, I think, was very hopeful until it came to an end a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, and oftentimes it gets mad over one particular phrase or one particular clause that people have an issue with it. Yeah. But you know what I was getting to, Dr. Farrell, the issue of how civic-minded we are as citizens. I think the vast majority of citizens in this country, and I'm subject to correction, have never stood up for anything in their lives. Beyond, I don't know, because I'm just talking in terms of my friends and stuff sometimes, and I'm saying, how can you go through your entire life and not stand up for anything?
I have a phrase here, Richard, and you may agree or disagree. Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Well, yes.
And that's what's at play. But a lot of the population are so engaged in bread and butter issues, shelter issues, that the higher issues sometimes get pushed aside because you're so engaged in survival on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, that's right. The daily struggle is real. The daily struggle for most people is real. And so therefore they don't have time and the space to kind of think about these things. And they don't recognize, quite frankly, that the things that they are struggling with are in fact at base in the Constitution. You know, I've been saying that things like crime, things like, WASA not fixing the roads and the potholes in the roads and so on, the fundamental issue there is an issue of accountability. Holding people to account for we worry about integrity, of course, but holding people to account for their performance. And I keep saying that you can't hold the constable or the licensing officer or the customs officer or the guy who is supposed to fix the road or the WASA turncock. You can't hold them accountable unless you hold people at the very top of the hierarchy accountable. So that's where we've got to start. And the recommendations that we have made in this report are actually moving us towards holding the top office holders accountable for integrity and for performance.
Well, some sociologists may suggest that some there's some philosophies that keep societal structures in place to keep that struggle at the bottom of the hierarchy of needs for the benefit of those
Of those at the top.
At the top, because
Yes.
then you're so consumed with struggling day to day. And
That's
I want to move the conversation to what's next, because I'm glad that you cleared up that the committee has no real issue with and I'm paraphrasing, you could correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes.
Politicians and political leaders are welcomed to share their opinions.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right? So Dr. Rowley's statement at the convention, it's just part of what the process is. Would you say that's correct?
That's correct, yes.
And you welcome Mrs. Sabi Sessa and any other political leader, NGOs,
Absolutely.
civil society
Absolutely.
organizations. It's not a document that's a fait accompli.
That's correct. Absolutely correct. Well,
right. So with that said, there has been an extension granted, and now there's a conference planned. What then is the objective of the conference, and what format will it take?
Right. So if you look at the report, you will see that our terms of reference included a conference. So the idea always was that the report would be, the idea was to create a working document. So section 5 of our report we call it a working document. That document lays out the recommendations chapter by chapter, based on the current constitution, of the recommendations that we have made for reform. That document forms the basis for the conference. We're calling it different names: conference, convention, constituent assembly. But conceptually, the idea is that what you do is that you bring together people who are representatives of political parties, because political parties are extremely important at this stage, because political parties actually represent whole blocks of people. Right? We're not saying necessarily that political parties are monolithic in their thinking, but they do represent blocks of people. So you want political parties to be involved. You want to have civil society organizations to be involved. You want the business community, the trade union movement. You want the NGOs to be involved. And then you want to have you want to have the public present. Why present? Because the idea is that you would have people who are delegates, so political parties and NGOs and so on would send delegates to the convention. The delegates would be in a position where they would be looking at the issues, and they would consider if there is consensus. There may be consensus on particular things, and there may be some differences. And you have a process where those are discussed, but it's a conference, so you have to manage that. And then you can have people decide at the conference which one of the 2 positions or 3 positions that they are in favor of. And then that then becomes the new position that will then be drafted as a draft constitution to go to the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago.
Understood. So, and following the convention or meeting or whatever we want to call it, or discussion, what is expected to happen? Is there a document expected to come out of that?
Well, so conceptually, what will happen is that you're not drafting any constitution at a convention. You're discussing the issues that are put forward. At that stage, if the convention arrives at consensus on changes to the constitution, it would then need to go to a drafting committee. There's a bunch of lawyers whose responsibility it would be to draft the thing in legal language, right?
A bill.
A draft constitution, similar to what Wooding and they did and what Principles of Fairness did and so on. You actually draft a constitution, and then that draft constitution, which reflects what comes out of the convention, would then go forward to the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago.
Well, hopefully. Well, it's an interesting process. Can I ask you to take off one hat and put on another hat now?
Yes.
I didn't prep you before on this, so I apologize in advance. You're an economist. I'm going to take down this banner, so that we will know we've ended our conversation on constitutional reform.
Yes.
And we've entered a conversation now on economics, because this is your training in addition to law, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Right. How we're heading into a budget cycle in Trinidad and Tobago. What do you think are the main challenges facing us economically in the country? I know we only have 10 minutes, and I'm putting you in an unfair position, but
you only have 10 minutes, Paul. Let me just say in sort of in summary, and then you can probably take off. We are not in a good place. We are not in a good place in as far as the economy is concerned. The fundamentals are not in a good place. particularly if you start with the energy sector, for example, and you look at what is happening in respect of the production of natural gas, you can essentially forget about oil, because oil is now way down below, I think it's about 50,000 barrels a day, which is extremely low. But equally, natural gas production is down and is continuing to remain down. So we are way down from our peak of 4.2 BCF a day. We are now well below 3 BCF per day. I think we're down to about 2.7 BCF per day in Trinidad and Tobago now. And that has had implications in a number of respects. Number one, in respect of, say, LNG, Train 1 is down, and I don't see any prospect, quite frankly, of Train 1 coming back up, if ever at all. There's been, of course, a restructuring of the arrangement of the ownership of Atlantic LNG, but I don't see Train 1 coming back into operation. Secondly, so LNG exports are down. Secondly, in respect of the petrochemical sector, that is production of ammonia and methanol, that sector basically has been limping for the last, I would say maybe about since 2011. We've had curtailments and so on, but basically the companies down there are not in a good shape because they are not getting enough gas, number one. Number two, the gas sales contracts that they are getting are short-term contracts. They are like 2-year contracts and 3-year contracts. You can't work with that in that kind of business. The economics don't work for you when you have a gas sales contract of 2 years or 3 years. So very interestingly, one of the big companies down there, Nutrien, and I looked at the annual report, and they reported that they had to take a significant impairment on their Trinidad and Tobago business because of the short-term nature of the gas sales contract. So when you have to do a turnaround down there, and the turnaround might cost you 40, 50, 60 million US dollars, you want to be able to run that plant for another 5, 6, 7 years before you get to another turnaround. But if you can't plan that, and you have a gas sales contract of 2 or 3 years, it's not making sense, quite frankly. And therefore, they had to take an impairment. What that means is that they probably make a loss on the Trinidad operations, which means as far as the country is concerned, you're not going to get any tax revenue from one of the biggest players on the estate. So the estate is essentially limping along with whatever gas it can get.
The Minister of Finance recently indicated that because of the price of oil and gas and oil, and of course the production levels that you identify, the shortfalls of that the revenue intake in the country, the revenues of the country would have been overestimated based on where he pegged the price of gas and oil in the last budget. So the deficit went from $5 to I think $9 billion. Right? We're in an election cycle. Let's not keep that out of the conversation. What are the implications of that, in your opinion, for the upcoming budget, and what the minister's challenges are on the table?
Well, I mean, I suppose there are two ways to answer that. One is to try and answer it as a politician, right? And I'm not a politician. So politicians, if it's an election year, you could expect that the politicians will try to spend as much as they can in order to increase their chances of success at the polls. So that you could expect a budget that will probably do that. As an economist, what you would say is that, listen, you've got to cut your suit to based on the cloth that you have, and you've therefore got. And this is not something I've been saying for years now, that our public expenditure is, number one, it is too high, and a lot of it is spent on the wrong things. And we are not able as a country to take the tough decisions in respect of the bloated public sector that we have, which comes about as a result of the kind of economic model that we've been running here since the 1970s. And we are unable to break that. Politically, none of the political parties have been able to confront that and to break it. But we are getting to the point now, given what the trajectory for oil and for gas revenues and so on, where the thing is going to break by itself, because as the revenues decline, you can see certain things beginning to happen. You can see the debt going up, both domestic debt and external debt going up. You see the international reserves, the foreign exchange reserves declining, and forex availability is down. You see the central bank recently reduced the reserve requirement, in my view, purely to accommodate increased government borrowing and that is domestic borrowing from the commercial banking system, with all kinds of implications in terms of potential for increases in credit expansion, for increases in the money supply, for all of that. That goes with what I consider a very suspect decision on the part of the central bank. But that's a discussion that we can have at another time. And then we have all of these liabilities that are increasing, because when you don't pay people back their VAT refunds, so the VAT refunds are increasing, you're not paying contractors. These things are not visible. The extent of the overdraft on the central bank account, these things are not visible, but they are very much there. And they are reflective of a fiscal situation which is, I would say, is more than tight. I think it is extremely tight, and something is going to have to give at some point. It may not give in the next fiscal year because, as you quite rightly said, it's potentially an election year. But when you kick that can down the road, it just simply means that it's just simply going to get worse later on. Final point on that, Paul. The idea that Dragon and these other opportunities and so on are going to be game changers, Manatee and those things, they will not game changers. What will happen is that when they do come on stream in 2027 and so on, is that they will keep the thing going. They will keep Point Lisa sticking over, but they are not going to be game changers. And I don't see, quite frankly, in respect to the energy sector, any game changers on the horizon.
What's your definition of a game changer? I'd have to ask, because the Minister of Energy is certainly pretty optimistic, at least in what he says, that things will improve over the next 2 to 3 years in terms of gas and access to gas.
They will, because if you get Dragon, if Manatee comes on stream and you get access to the Lauren part of the Lauren Manatee field, and there's another smaller cross-border field, that you can have access to. Yes, those things will help, but I'm saying that what they will not take you back up to 4.2 BCF. They will not even take you back up to 3.5 BCF. Remember, with every day that passes, your existing fields are depleting. Your existing fields are running down. So you've got to run faster to deal with that, and also to add a capacity, and I don't see that happening. I don't see where that is going to come from. The Calypso field, which is the BHP Woodside field, which is off the east coast of Tobago, is supposed to be a fairly big field, but that has not had final investment decision as yet. And I think essentially they are waiting on the appropriate fiscal terms before they could even that's in deep water, and is therefore going to be extremely expensive. And they are waiting on the correct fiscal terms to enable them to do that. But the difficulty is that the better the terms are to bring something like Calypso into production, which might take a couple of years, it's not good for the petrochemical sector. It's not good for ammonia and methanol, because your price of gas at the gate, at the fence, is going to be significantly higher, which is going to be uneconomic for them. So it's a very, very delicate situation, and it's tough, and it's something that I essentially predicted 5 years ago.
I know you were at one point on, I forget the name of the committee, because you offer yourself, well, you are asked to and obliged so many of these. I think it was the post-COVID transformation committee or something.
No, the roadmap to recovery. No, I was not on the roadmap.
Oh, you weren't that? Okay.
No, I was not.
Do you see any opportunities that will bear fruit in the medium to long term in Trinidad and Tobago, that are on the way, that you think are good steps in the right direction?
Well, let me just say, I think that the Ministry of Trade and Industry has been trying, in terms of trying to move certain initiatives forward in respect of trying to diversify. So I commend them for that. But one of the problems that we have is that you need, for the non-energy sector, for the diversification process, you need to have as much, if not more, focus and attention and intellectual capacity directed at that as you do on the energy sector, and we don't. Secondly, the institutional framework for making diversification happen is something which we don't have. So we have only now looking at, bringing Invest TT and Export TT and all of those agencies and so on, which had multiplied, bringing them together into one agency to be able to move that forward. The Phoenix Park Industrial Estate, which was built by the Chinese, Beijing Construction, did that. I mean, the potential for that is significant, provided that you had brought in additional Chinese firms and so on who would have access to the South American market and so on. So that still remains potential. But the point I'm making is that the creative sectors, the tourism sector, we chased away sandals quite foolishly, in my view. We have missed so many opportunities that, but we've got to start. You've got to start now in terms of trying to get that diversification process on track. And that's what I can see. I mean,
that word, Dr. Farrell, thank you so much. We appreciate your time and your contribution.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome.